Great, thank you. So in the space of the next 15 minutes or so, I would like to do three things. The first thing is to give you a global overview of the state of human happiness across the world and how that matches up against our well-known GDP measures of growth and progress. The second thing is to then ask ourselves the question whether these kind of economic measures, the standard measures of progress, are really the useful ones in light of the data that I'll be presenting you. And then finally, what I'd like to do is to provide you with some practical interventions that we could introduce to actually raise human well-being in both a policy and a business context. Now, the facts and insights that I'll try and share with you are mostly stemming from our own research or that from close collaborators, so let me know if you agree or disagree with any of it. So let's have a look at the global state of happiness. Behind me, there's a lot of circles. Each one of these represents a country. Larger circles represent larger countries in terms of population size, so you'll quickly pick up on places such as India, China, and the US of A. The way we measure happiness is by going into each of these countries and asking representative samples questions around how satisfied they are with their lives. And this on a scale from 1 to 10. And so you'll find that there's in fact no country that has an average happiness below 3, and no country that scores any higher than 8 out of 10 in terms of average happiness. All right, on the horizontal axis, you find your usual measure of progress, which is the economic measure of GDP per capita, and so on and so forth. So let me run you through what I think are the main lessons to be learned from this, what I believe, important graph, and those are the following. First and foremost, the poor nations tend to be much less happy than the wealthier nations. So there's no question whatsoever that under these circumstances, further economic growth can actually do a lot of good in terms of raising welfare and well-being. But at the same time, I'm sure you'll agree with me that there seems to be a tendency towards diminishing returns in terms of happiness as we move through further growth and GDP per capita figures. In fact, if we zoom in on those countries that are relatively wealthy, at say above 20,000 GDP per capita, you'll find it's very hard to start deciphering a clear relationship whatsoever between growth and well-being. Now, I don't want to sort of present a too simple picture of this really, really complex relationship because sometimes we do find sudden drops and changes in these data, even for relatively wealthy countries. So have a look, for example, at Greece, who, as you know, are going through a deep recession. But the happiness data that we pick up from Greece has actually fallen well below any historical records we have for Greece, and has fallen much more than one could have anticipated from just looking at the losses in GDP per capita. In fact, I would argue that this is the untold story of their recession. We hear and read a lot about the economic figures being very bad, but the social misery, the psychological damage being done here, which is what we pick up in these data, is, I think, even more important and presumably longer lasting if we'll look back in due course. Okay, so it seems like there's a bit of an asymmetry in the way that we experience ups and downs in the global economic business cycles. We're much more sensitive to losses in growth than we are to equivalent gains. And so it's important that policymakers, and say central bankers especially, start taking this slightly more, or take more note of these kind of measures and bring this into policy. Okay, so on a more positive note, perhaps, I presume you're interested to find out who the happiest populations are. And here the usual suspects come to the fore, which is obviously the Scandinavian countries and Switzerland as well. But you'll agree, presumably, that the main lesson here to be taken from this graph really, really is these diminishing returns. Further economic growth is no longer a guarantee and does no longer necessarily translate into more well-being and welfare, right? And the sad truth is that this has been the case for a while amongst the wealthy and the developed nations. So take a look, for example, at what I'm graphing here. This is the European Commission's data, a weighted average of happiness of all the European nations put together for over the past 3 decades, so since about 1985. And what you'll see is pretty much a flat line. Right? There's some movement, but it looks like we're having a lot of trouble getting away from that 3 on the scale from 1 to 4. This should stem us to think a little bit and reflect around these measures, especially because in terms of GDP growth, we've been doing exceptionally well. Look at this. Here I'm mapping how well we've been doing economically on top of our well-being numbers. So what you'll see is that we've essentially grown our income, our GDP, by over 50%. We've moved from 25,000 GDP per capita to about 35,000 GDP per capita, and this is inflation adjusted, right? So it's perhaps time to come to the conclusion that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of its national income. And what's really quite striking is that this is Simon Kuznets who said it. And you may not know who Simon Kuznets is, but he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist who developed the notion of GDP and national accounts. So let me get this straight. The person who developed the notion of GDP, when he presented this to US Congress in 1934, told US Congress, do not take this, my measure, as a measure of social progress and welfare, right? What have we been doing? We've been focusing in on GDP growth numbers, productivity, and earnings all the time, as if it were ends in and of themselves rather than means to an end, right? Now, if you agree with me that it's about time we start putting human well-being a little bit more center stage in both business and policy, well, then I've got good news for you, because we're starting to build a lot of causal evidence for the fact that there's good reasons to actually do so. So for example, in the context of policy, rising or increasing people's happiness has causal impact on their health and leads them to lead longer lives. Longevity rises. Happier individuals are also more pro-social, and we picked this up in data on donations or data on volunteering. And the great thing about this is this is a bit of a virtuous cycle, because then in turn they become happier again, right? Another aspect where we find that happiness has real objective outcomes is in terms of risk behavior. And this will sound a little bit quirky, but in our data, we've got a paper showing that happier individuals wear their seatbelts more often, and they get less involved in motor vehicle accidents. And the logic here is really quite straightforward. It's happier individuals value their lives more greatly, and as such, they tend to take more care of it in kind of day-to-day situations, right? In the context of business, there's perhaps even more to be said for raising people's well-being, because recent surveys seem to be indicating that we're not doing very well. People are unhappy while in the workplace. In fact, the second worst time in terms of happiness throughout the day is the time spent with our boss. And that comes in as a close second behind commuting. And I'm thinking, or I'm starting to think, that it may be due to the fact that you're wasting your time and thinking about your boss all at the same time. And so you're smiling. But this is really quite important for a business context, because we know just how important this aspect is. People's well-being or employees' well-being, how much it impacts productivity. In fact, it impacts productivity. We now notice, thanks to laboratory experiments, it raises productivity between 7 and 12%, depending on the study. Right? And so this just doesn't stick to just the individual. We pick this up at the firm level too. So I've got a colleague who is looking at the companies who tend to be in the newspapers a lot for being the best places to work for. What he did is the following. He compiled in kind of a stock indices all the companies over the years that have been part of the 100 best places to work for in America. And they looked at how these companies did as compared to their industry indices on the stock market. And what he found is really quite amazing. He found that had you invested in that portfolio, you would have had an annualized return that is 2% higher than what the usual industry indices for these industries were. And this is dating back from 1985 again till about now. So this is quite striking. It feels, or it seems like the markets aren't fully valuing these intangibles, such as job satisfaction and employee well-being. And so this is quite important. There's something going on here. Now, some of you may be thinking, hey, wait a second. If we can raise our earnings, well, then our job satisfaction will be better in return, right? It'll be better too. But here I've got some really, and you're absolutely right, but it's more subtle than that. And there's really exciting new research which kind of shows that, well, sure, but your job satisfaction survey results actually are more predictive of later earnings than earnings are of later job satisfaction surveys. So something is going on here, and I wish we had more time to develop it and discuss it. Okay, but I suppose by now you will hopefully agree with me that there's a lot of objective benefits to this notion of subjective well-being. Okay. So if that's the case, what can we do practically? So it's about time we start thinking about processes that we can put in place. Some of you will be thinking about, hey, well, why not flexi time, letting people work from home, or meditation classes, or sports classes, or really emphasizing positive contributions that people are making and having colleagues write thank you notes to other colleagues and all that kind of stuff. I like that, and it works to some extent. But I'm hoping to advocate for more structural interventions of the kind that really foster participation and can actually have lingering social capital effects over time. And here I'm thinking, and actually really inspired by a paper of colleagues who've shown that it's not just how much you pay your employees, but it's also, and perhaps even more, about how you pay your employees. The process matters. The way they found out about this is they looked at pay packages, compensation packages that were the same across the board, that essentially paid the same in the end. But those pay packages that had aspects of profit sharing, group bonuses, share purchase plans as part of the package actually did better in raising employee well-being. And the amazing thing was, it's not just that it raised well-being, it was also leading to less absenteeism, less job turnover of employees for the firm, and in turn, I would presume, a lot of productivity gains and earning gains. All right. Some companies are putting this into place. So you will have heard of exceptional companies like Gore-Tex or Semco in Brazil or Chronoflex here in France. And they actually do much more than what I've just been talking about. But it'd be great if we have more examples and more data to study on these kind of interventions that are quite progressive and allow for more participation in the workplace. Now, here's another sort of bold idea with regards to potential interventions, and that's why wouldn't we tie managers' bonuses to some extent to the job satisfaction for the people that work for them or their teams, right? If it's so effective. That way, it would avoid a lot of managers just paying lip service to this notion of a happy and a healthy work environment. It would actually incentivize them to do something about it, right? So that's just an idea, but I'd like to develop that a lot more and see it happen and see what the effects would be. Okay, so this is not just limited, obviously, to a corporate business setting. There's very much a notion of this being possible within a policy context as well. And I'm excited to share with you the fact that we've got results from experiments where we've ran this in a taxation environment. Most of you will presumably agree that taxes aren't associated with much happiness, and that's something we definitely pick up in the data. But what we did in the lab here was we've allowed some of the groups, we provide them with intervention where they were allowed to express their preferences and share with us where they thought their tax money ought to go. Of course, this remains symbolic, but the mere fact of getting a sense and having a voice in this process seemed to be driving a lot of interesting results. We were hoping for less frustration with taxes, and that's exactly what we found. But we also found something else. And to our surprise to some extent, we also found objective outcomes from this costless intervention of giving people a bit more say in the process, and that was that we found greater tax compliance. People were cheating less in the lab as compared to a group of people who weren't allowed to express their preferences around the where the tax contributions would ultimately go. And the jump was quite significant. It was actually a 16% jump in tax compliance and a reduction in taxpayer frustration, which one could equate with more well-being. So this to say, and let me conclude perhaps on that, is that there are many, and I know there are many, interventions and proposals that we can do to really raise well-being, and that I believe drive both, or can drive both, the old and the new types of measures of social progress. And I'm hoping that we're going to finally leave behind these kind of narrow 20th century ways of thinking around how much to grow the economy or how much to grow a business or a business unit, and that we'll be moving more and more towards thinking in terms of how do we grow? Is it sustainable? Is it inclusive? Does it actually raise human well-being? Thank you.